The morning sun cast long shadows across the military firing range as Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his red ceremonial tunic. At 32, he had spent the last 8 years as a member of the Queen's Guard, standing motionless outside Buckingham Palace, enduring tourists' cameras and the occasional foolish attempt to make him smile or move. Today was different, though. Today was the annual inter-regiment shooting competition, and James found himself representing the ceremonial guards against some of the Army's most elite units. The other soldiers were already gathering around the equipment tables, checking their rifles and discussing their strategies in loud, confident voices. James recognized several faces from the Parachute Regiment, the Royal Marines, and even a few from the Special Reconnaissance Regiment. These were battle-hardened soldiers who had seen action in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other conflict zones around the world. Their uniforms bore the subtle marks of real combat experience: faded patches where insignia had been removed for operations, slightly worn edges on their boots, and the quiet confidence that came from having faced real danger. As James approached the group, the conversation gradually died down. He could feel their eyes on his immaculate red uniform, the polished brass buttons, and the perfectly positioned bearskin cap he carried under his arm. To them, he was just another ceremonial soldier, someone who spent his days standing like a statue for the entertainment of tourists. The divide between ceremonial troops and operational forces had always existed in the British Army, and James was well aware of where he stood in their estimation. "Well, well," said Corporal Davies from the Paras, his voice carrying across the morning air. "Looks like the Tourist Attraction Brigade has arrived." A few chuckles rippled through the group as other soldiers turned to look at James. Davies was a stocky man with close-cropped hair and the kind of swagger that came from 3 tours in Helmand Province. His shooting jacket was covered in patches and pins from various competitions, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never met a target he couldn't hit. James said nothing as he walked to the equipment table and began examining the rifles. The competition would use standard-issue L85A2 rifles, weapons he was certainly familiar with, though not ones he handled daily in his ceremonial duties. He picked up one of the rifles, checked the action, and tested the sight alignment with practiced efficiency. His movements were smooth and automatic, the result of muscle memory that ran deeper than his current assignment might suggest. "Careful there, mate," called out Marine Lance Corporal Thompson, a wiry Scotsman with a thick Highland accent. "Those aren't for drill practice. These actually fire real bullets." More laughter from the group, louder this time. Thompson had a reputation as one of the finest marksmen in the Royal Marines, with several prestigious shooting medals to his name. He gestured toward James's ceremonial uniform with obvious amusement. "Maybe you should have brought one of those wooden drill rifles instead." James continued his equipment check without responding, running his hands along the rifle's barrel and testing the trigger pull. The weapon was in good condition, well-maintained, and properly zeroed. He selected a shooting jacket from the pile of equipment and began putting it on over his red tunic. The contrast was stark. The utilitarian brown leather shooting jacket over the ornate ceremonial uniform created an almost comical appearance that wasn't lost on the watching soldiers. "This should be entertaining," muttered Sergeant Williams from the SRR, shaking his head with a grin. Williams was a legend in Special Forces circles, though few people knew exactly what operations he had been involved in. His presence at the competition was unusual. Most Special Forces soldiers avoided publicity or events where they might be photographed or identified. But Williams had a reputation for never backing down from any kind of challenge, whether it was in combat or competition. The range safety officer began calling for participants to take their positions for the preliminary round. The competition would start with standard prone shooting at 100 meters, progress to standing unsupported at 200 meters, and finish with a challenging rapid-fire sequence at 300 meters. Points would be awarded based on accuracy, with additional points for speed in the final round. As the soldiers moved toward the firing line, James found himself assigned to lane 15, right in the middle of the group. To his left was Davies, who was making a show of adjusting his shooting sling and commenting loudly about how this would be over quickly. To his right was Thompson, who was studying the wind flags with intense concentration and making notes in a small, weatherproof notebook. "Tell you what, Palace Guard," Davies said, turning to James with a patronizing smile. "Why don't we make this interesting? 100 quid says you don't even make it past the first round. Hell, I'll give you odds. 2 to 1 that you can't even keep all your shots on the target at 100 meters. James finally spoke, his voice quiet but clear. "I don't gamble," he said simply, settling into his shooting position and adjusting his rifle rest. "Of course you don't," laughed Thompson. "Probably not allowed to in your fancy job. Might disturb the tourists if word got out that the Queen's Guard had vices." He paused, then added with theatrical concern, "You do know which end the bullets come out of, don't you?" The other soldiers were openly grinning now, enjoying the show. Several had their phones out, clearly planning to record what they expected to be an embarrassing performance by the ceremonial soldier. The general assumption was that this would be a brief and amusing diversion before the real competition began among the experienced marksmen. James said nothing, focusing instead on his breathing and sight picture as the range safety officer began the final safety briefing. The command, "Commence firing," echoed across the range, and immediately the air filled with the sharp crack of rifle fire. James settled deeper into his shooting position, his body finding the natural point of aim that every trained marksman develops through countless hours of practice. The familiar weight of the rifle felt comfortable in his hands, and he began his shooting sequence with methodical precision. His first shot broke cleanly, the recoil absorbed smoothly through his shoulder and back into the ground. Without hurrying, he worked the bolt action, ejected the spent case, and chambered another round. His breathing was controlled. Inhale, exhale halfway, hold, squeeze, follow through. Each shot was identical to the last, a rhythm that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. Around him, the other shooters were firing at their own pace, some faster, some slower, but all with the confidence of experienced marksmen. Davies was shooting rapidly, his bolt action smooth and practiced. Thompson was taking more time between shots, clearly applying the precision shooting techniques that had made him famous among the Marines. The sharp smell of gunpowder filled the air, and empty brass cases accumulated in small piles beside each shooter. After 10 rounds, the first detail was complete. Targets were retrieved and scored while the second detail took their turn. James stood up from his position and automatically began cleaning his rifle barrel with a pull-through, removing any copper fouling that might affect his next group of shots. It was an old habit, one that marked him as someone who took shooting seriously. "Let's see how the toy soldier did," Davies announced loudly, reaching for James's target as the scoring team brought them back from the butts. The other soldiers gathered around, expecting to see the wild shots and poor grouping that would confirm their assumptions about ceremonial troops. Davies unfolded the target, and his expression changed immediately. Instead of the scattered holes he expected, there was a tight cluster of 10 shots gathered in the center ring, with 9 of them touching the bullseye and the 10th just barely outside it. The group measured less than 2 inches across at 100 meters. Shooting that would be impressive for any soldier and exceptional for someone supposedly trained only for ceremonial duties. "Bloody hell," Thompson muttered, peering over Davies's shoulder at the target. "That's not beginner's luck." He looked at James with new interest, noting for the first time the way the Royal Guard held himself, the unconscious military bearing that went beyond ceremonial training. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" James was already preparing for the next stage of competition, adjusting his sling and checking his rifle zero. "Basic training, same as everyone else," he replied simply, though several of the soldiers exchanged glances. Basic training could teach you to hit a target, but the kind of precision they had just witnessed came from somewhere else entirely. Sergeant Williams from the SRR had been watching quietly from the side, and now he moved closer to examine James's target more carefully. Williams had an eye for talent, and what he was seeing didn't match the story. The shot group wasn't just accurate, it showed the kind of technical precision that came from advanced marksmanship training. The shots were evenly distributed around the point of aim, suggesting excellent fundamental skills and possibly even mind-reading ability that wouldn't be taught in basic training. "Interesting grouping," Williams said casually, but his eyes were studying James carefully. "Very consistent. Lot of practice shooting competitively?" "Not recently," James answered, breaking down his rifle to check for any fouling or debris before the next round. His movements were efficient and professional, showing a level of familiarity with weapons maintenance that was notable. Most ceremonial troops maintained their weapons to parade standard, but James was checking his rifle like someone whose life might depend on its reliability. The second phase of competition was standing unsupported shooting at 200 meters, a much more challenging test of marksmanship skills. The targets were smaller, the distance was doubled, and shooting without support meant that every tiny movement would be magnified. This was where experience and training would really show, separating the competent shots from the true marksman. Davies was still studying James's first target, shaking his head in confusion. "Must have been the wind," he muttered, though everyone knew the morning air was perfectly still. "Let's see how he does when it gets difficult." But there was less confidence in his voice now, and several of the other soldiers were no longer joking about the palace guard's chances. As they moved to the 200-meter firing line, James noticed that the casual mockery had quieted down. Soldiers who had been laughing and making jokes were now watching him more carefully, trying to reconcile what they had just seen with their assumptions about ceremonial troops. A few were starting to whisper among themselves, speculating about where a Queen's Guard might have learned to shoot like that. Thompson fell into step beside James as they walked to the new firing positions. "You know," he said quietly, "I've been shooting competitively for 12 years. And that target back there was better than most of my Royal Marine snipers can manage on their first attempt. You sure you haven't done this before?" James smiled slightly but didn't answer directly. "Every soldier should be able to hit what he aims at," he said. "That's basic soldiering, isn't it?" But Thompson wasn't satisfied with that answer. He had noticed other things now, the way James carried himself, the automatic weapons handling, the fact that his boots, while perfectly polished for ceremony, showed the kind of wear patterns that came from serious field training. This wasn't adding up to the simple story of a ceremonial soldier who happened to be good with a rifle. The standing position required a completely different set of skills. Without the support of the ground, every heartbeat, every breath, every tiny muscle tremor would affect the shot. James took his position, feet shoulder-width apart, rifle held in the classic standing position with his left elbow tucked tight against his body for stability. His stance was textbook perfect, showing the kind of training that most soldiers only received in advanced marksmanship courses. Around him, the other competitors were settling into their own positions, some struggling slightly with the transition from supported to unsupported shooting. Davies was having trouble finding a stable position, shifting his feet repeatedly and adjusting his grip on the rifle. Even Thompson, despite his reputation, was taking longer than usual to find his natural point of aim at the increased distance. James, however, seemed completely comfortable. He found his position quickly, made one minor adjustment to his stance, and then became perfectly still. His breathing was slow and controlled, and when the command came to commence firing, his first shot broke with the same smooth precision he had shown in the prone position. The watching soldiers had stopped talking entirely now. Word was beginning to spread among the other competitors that something unusual was happening in Lane 15, that the ceremonial soldier was shooting far better than anyone had expected. Phones that had been out to record an amusing failure were now capturing something entirely different. When the targets came back from the 200-meter range, the silence was complete. James's second target showed another impossibly tight group, this time with all 10 shots within the bull's eye and 8 of them clustered in the center ring. At 200 meters, shooting standing unsupported, it was the kind of performance that would win national competitions. Davies stared at the target in his hands, no longer bothering to hide his confusion and growing concern. "This is impossible," he said finally, holding up the target for everyone to see. "Nobody shoots like this without serious training. I mean serious, advanced training." He looked directly at James, his earlier mockery replaced by genuine puzzlement. "Who the hell are you really?" Williams had been making quiet phone calls between shooting stages, and now he approached James with a different expression on his face. The casual competitiveness was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like recognition. "Mitchell," he said quietly. "James Mitchell. Served with 22 SAS from 2015 to 2019. 2 tours in Syria, 1 in Afghanistan. Sniper qualified, close protection qualified, counterterrorism qualified." He paused, studying James's face. "Transferred to ceremonial duties after taking shrapnel from an IED outside Raqqa." The gathered soldiers fell silent, the pieces finally falling into place. Everything made sense now. The precision shooting, the weapons handling, the quiet confidence, even the way James carried himself. This wasn't a ceremonial soldier who happened to be good with a rifle. This was one of the most elite soldiers in the British Army, someone who had been trained to shoot in the most demanding circumstances imaginable. James said nothing, continuing to prepare his rifle for the final stage of competition. But his silence was confirmation enough for the watching soldiers. Several of them stepped back instinctively, the casual mockery of the morning now seeming embarrassingly inappropriate. They had been making jokes about someone who had operated behind enemy lines, who had been trained to kill with precision at distances they could barely imagine. "The final stage," announced the range safety officer, "will be rapid fire at 300 meters. Competitors will have 30 seconds to fire 10 rounds, scoring based on both accuracy and time. This simulates combat conditions where speed and precision are equally important." Davies was no longer betting against James. Instead, he was studying him with the respect reserved for proven warriors. "I heard about that operation in Syria," he said quietly. "The one where SAS Sniper took out 4 ISIS commanders from over a kilometer away. That was you, wasn't it?" James finally looked directly at him. "I don't talk about operational details," he said simply. But the way he said it confirmed what everyone was now thinking. Thompson shook his head in amazement. "And here I was taking the piss about you not knowing which end the bullets come out of. Jesus Christ, Mitchell, why didn't you say something?" "Because it doesn't matter," James replied, settling into his final shooting position. "I'm here representing the Queen's Guard, not the regiment. Today I'm just another soldier trying to hit the target." But that wasn't true, and everyone knew it. The final stage of competition was about to begin, and word had spread throughout the range that Lane 15 contained someone very special indeed. Other competitions had stopped to watch, and even the range staff were gathering to see what would happen when one of the most elite soldiers in the British military let loose with everything he had. The 300-meter targets were barely visible to the naked eye, small black circles that would challenge even experienced marksmen. In rapid fire, most soldiers would be lucky to keep all their shots on the target, let alone achieve any real precision. The combination of distance, time pressure, and the need to work the bolt action quickly made this the most demanding stage of any shooting competition. James took his position with the same calm efficiency he had shown all morning, but now there was something different in his demeanor, a subtle change that suggested he was no longer holding back. For the first time, he adjusted his position more than once, fine-tuning everything for maximum performance. His breathing pattern changed, becoming deeper and more controlled. When he looked through the rifle scope, his entire body settled into perfect stillness. The command came, "Commence firing!" What happened next was unlike anything the watching soldiers had ever seen. James's rifle began speaking with mechanical precision, the bolt action working so smoothly it seemed automatic. Shot after shot broke with identical timing, the brass cases ejecting in perfect arcs to land in a neat pile beside him. His shooting position never varied, his sight picture never wavered, and his rhythm never faltered. 10 shots in 26 seconds, each one placed with deliberate precision despite the incredible speed. When James set down his rifle and stood up from his position, there was no doubt about what had just happened. The other soldiers had witnessed something extraordinary, a demonstration of the kind of skills that were rarely seen outside of Special Forces operations. Williams was the first to speak. "That," he said quietly, "was a masterclass in combat marksmanship." He turned to the other soldiers, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen the best of the best. "What you just watched is why the SAS has the reputation it does. This man could put rounds on target at that distance all day long, under any conditions you can imagine." When the final target came back, the gathered crowd let out a collective intake of breath. All 10 shots were not just on target, but clustered in a group no larger than a man's fist. At 300 meters, firing rapidly under time pressure, James had achieved the kind of accuracy that most soldiers couldn't manage shooting slowly from a bench rest. Davies walked over to James, his earlier bravado completely gone. "I owe you an apology," he said seriously. "We all do. We judged you by the uniform instead of the man wearing it." James was cleaning his rifle with the same methodical care he had shown all morning. "No apology needed," he said. "You saw a Queen's Guard and made reasonable assumptions. That's normal. Most ceremonial soldiers aren't trained the way I was." "Why the transfer?" Thompson asked. "I mean, from the regiment to ceremonial duties, that must have been a hell of an adjustment." For the first time all day, James's expression softened slightly. "Sometimes the war follows you home," he said quietly. "Sometimes you need to step back and remember what you're fighting for. Standing guard at the palace, watching families take pictures, seeing kids wave at you, it reminds you that there are things worth protecting." He finished cleaning his rifle and began packing it away. "Besides, someone has to keep the tourists entertained." The joke fell flat, but not because it wasn't funny. It fell flat because everyone present now understood the sacrifice involved. James Mitchell had given up one of the most prestigious positions in the military to take a job where his real skills would be invisible, where his service record would be unknown, where tourists would see him as nothing more than a colorful statue. As the competition concluded and the soldiers began cleaning up their equipment, word continued to spread about what had happened. The story would be told and retold in mess halls and pubs across the military, growing with each telling until it became legend. The day when a group of elite soldiers mocked a Queen's Guard, only to discover they had been challenging one of the deadliest marksmen in the British Army. James walked away from the range still wearing his red ceremonial tunic under the shooting jacket, the contrast no longer seeming ridiculous, but somehow appropriate. He was both soldiers, the ceremonial guard who stood motionless for the cameras and the Special Forces operator who could end lives with surgical precision. Both were equally valid expressions of military service, and both deserved respect. The teasing had stopped permanently, replaced by something much more valuable, the recognition that service comes in many forms, and that sometimes the most dangerous soldiers are the ones who choose to stand quietly in the shadows, protecting what matters most.